Why fans think Baris Arduc changed forever in 2026. There's a moment in a career where something shifts. You can't always name it. You can't always see it in real time. But when you look back, you realize that was the turning point. That was the moment everything changed. For Baris Arduc, fans believe that moment came in 2026. And what makes this story so fascinating is not just what happened. It's how millions of people noticed it, discussed it, debated it, and came to very different conclusions about what it all means. So let's talk about it. Honestly. Carefully. And with everything we actually know. Baris Arduc has never been just another Turkish actor. Since his breakout years, he built a reputation that was almost impossible to replicate, charming but grounded, private but magnetic, talented in a way that felt effortless. His fans didn't just follow his career. They felt connected to him on a level that's rare in entertainment. They watched every interview. They tracked every project. They paid attention to the small things. The way he spoke about his craft. The way he carried himself publicly. The energy he brought to red carpets, press tours, and social media. For years, there was a consistency to Baris Arduc that made fans feel like they knew him. And then, somewhere around 2026, something changed. Or at least, that's what fans started saying. The question we need to answer is this. Did Baris Arduc actually change? Or did the world around him change? Or is this one of those stories where the truth is far more complicated than either side wants to admit? Let's start at the beginning. To understand why 2026 felt so significant to fans, you have to understand how Baris Arduc built his career in the years leading up to it. He wasn't an overnight sensation. He worked his way through Turkish television and film with the kind of steady, deliberate approach that earns respect. His roles varied. His performances deepened. Every few years, he would take on something that surprised people, something that showed a new layer, and audiences rewarded him with loyalty. By the early 2020s, his international fanbase was growing in ways that even longtime Turkish entertainment observers found remarkable. This wasn't just regional popularity. Subtitled clips of his performances were going viral in South America, in Southeast Asia, in parts of Europe where Turkish drama had built a fierce following. He was becoming one of those rare figures who transcended language barriers almost entirely through screen presence and emotional authenticity. His social media following ballooned. But here's something important to note, he wasn't a social media actor. He wasn't constantly performing for the camera in his personal life. He shared selectively. And that selectivity made every post feel like a window rather than a performance. Fans felt like they were getting something real whenever he chose to share. That relationship, that unspoken trust between Baris Arduc and his audience, is at the heart of everything that came next. Because when that feeling started to shift, fans noticed immediately. The conversations began in fan communities on X, formerly known as Twitter, on Instagram comment sections, on dedicated fan forums that some of these international communities had been running for years. The tone wasn't hostile. Not at first. It was more like quiet concern. More like people saying, does anyone else feel like something is different? Does anyone else feel like he seems distant lately? Like the warmth is still there on screen but something behind it has changed. These conversations picked up pace throughout early 2026. And what's striking about them is how specific they were. Fans weren't just making vague emotional complaints. They were pointing to things. Concrete observations. The way he spoke about certain topics in interviews had shifted. His body language at public appearances seemed more guarded. Projects he took on raised questions. Choices he made, professionally and in terms of public image, felt inconsistent with the version of himself he had presented for years. Now, before we go further, it's important to be clear about something. Much of what we're discussing here is fan observation and fan perception. This is what fans believe, what fans noticed, what fans discussed publicly. Baris Arduc himself has not made a sweeping public statement saying yes, I changed, or no, nothing is different. So we have to hold this carefully. We're not inside his head. We're looking at the public picture from the outside, the way his audience sees it. But fan perception matters. Especially when it's as widespread and as consistent as what happened in 2026. One of the first things fans pointed to was a shift in his professional choices. In the years before 2026, Baris Arduc had built a reputation for being thoughtful about the projects he attached himself to. He wasn't someone who chased commercial success at the expense of quality. He had turned down things. He had waited for the right roles. Fans respected that immensely. It signaled that he cared more about the work than the paycheck, more about craft than fame. Then came a stretch of choices that confused people. This is where fan communities began splitting into camps. Some felt the projects he pursued or discussed in 2026 felt more commercially calculated, less artistically driven. Others defended him fiercely, arguing that every artist evolves, that taking on different types of work is not a betrayal of who you are, and that fans were projecting their own expectations onto a person who is ultimately free to make his own choices. Both sides had valid points. Both sides were genuinely passionate. And neither side could fully see the whole picture, because none of them were sitting in his meetings or inside his creative process. But here's where the story gets more interesting. Because the professional choices were only part of it. There was something about his public presence in 2026 that felt different to people who had followed him closely for years. Interviews that had once felt candid and warm started feeling more polished, more managed. Not dishonest. Not fake. Just careful. Like someone who had learned to control the narrative rather than simply exist within it. And for fans who had loved him precisely because he didn't seem to be performing off-screen, that shift felt meaningful. One interview in particular became a focal point of discussion. The specific outlet and date are something fans referenced repeatedly in online conversations, though the interpretations varied wildly depending on who you asked. In this interview, Baris Arduc spoke about his relationship with fame in a way that some fans found reflective and mature, while others read it as someone who had become disconnected from the authenticity that made them fall in love with him in the first place. Same words. Completely different reactions. That kind of polarized response tells you something important. It tells you that people were watching through the lens of their own emotional investment. And that emotional investment is real. Let's not dismiss it. When someone's work has moved you, when their presence has brought joy into your life over years of watching, you develop a relationship with the idea of that person. It's not delusional. It's human. But it also means that any change, any evolution, any growth in a direction you didn't expect, can feel like a loss. Some fans started asking a question that became something of a recurring theme in these online discussions. They asked, when did the ambition start to feel different? Not ambition itself, which fans had always admired in him, but a specific quality of ambition. Because there's a version of ambition that feels like creative hunger, like someone who is chasing better and more honest work. And there's another version that fans sometimes describe as looking more like personal positioning. Image management. Brand building in the commercial sense. And fans felt, rightly or wrongly, that something had tilted in the latter direction. Again, this is perception. This is what the audience felt. Whether it reflects Baris Arduc's actual inner life and motivations, none of us can say with certainty. But here's something that complicates the picture in a genuinely interesting way. Because while some fans were saying he had become more calculated, others were pointing to signs of real vulnerability in 2026. Moments where he seemed less guarded, not more. There were reports, and the word reports here means things that circulated publicly and were discussed widely, not confirmed private information, that he was navigating significant personal and professional transitions around this time. And fans who read his public presence through that lens saw something completely different. They didn't see someone becoming cold or commercial. They saw someone processing. Someone carrying something heavy and trying to figure out how to do it with dignity. This is the paradox at the center of this whole story. The same public moments, the same interviews, the same choices, read completely differently depending on what lens you bring to them. And that tells us something not just about Baris Arduc, but about how we relate to public figures in general. We construct them. We build versions of them in our heads based on what they show us and what we feel in ourselves. And when the real person does something unexpected, something that doesn't fit our constructed version, it feels like a contradiction. It feels like change. Even when the person is simply being more fully themselves than we were previously equipped to see. Now let's talk about the social media dimension of this, because it's impossible to discuss 2026 without it. The year saw a significant shift in how Baris Arduc engaged, or didn't engage, with his online audience. Posting patterns changed. The kind of content that appeared changed. And for a fanbase that had become accustomed to reading his social media presence like a conversation, the shift felt significant. Some fans read this as withdrawal. Some read it as growth, as someone who had decided to stop feeding a machine that was never truly serving him anyway. Some saw it as evidence that he was going through something personal. Others saw it as the inevitable evolution of someone who had realized that constant digital availability comes at a cost. Here's something worth noting. There is a documented and widely discussed phenomenon in celebrity culture where stars who were once highly accessible online gradually pull back. Sometimes this happens after negative experiences with toxic fan behavior. Sometimes it happens because of the mental health cost of constant public scrutiny. Sometimes it happens simply because someone has reached a stage in their career where they no longer feel the need to maintain that level of digital presence. All of these are legitimate reasons. None of them require a dramatic explanation. But in the absence of an explanation, fans fill the silence with their own stories. And in 2026, the silence around certain aspects of Baris Arduc's life was loud enough that fans couldn't help but try to fill it. There were also conversations, more speculative, and worth labeling clearly as speculation, about the people around him. Who he was spending time with professionally. Which advisors or management figures were influencing his decisions. This kind of speculation is always tricky because it often veers into territory that's both unfair to the people being speculated about and ultimately unknowable from the outside. But it reflects something real. Fans were trying to understand what had changed by looking for an external cause. Because if something external changed him, then the version of him they loved is still in there somewhere. That's the emotional logic. That's the hope underneath the concern. This is a story about more than one man's career trajectory. It's a story about what we expect from the people we admire. About the impossible standards we sometimes set for public figures without realizing we're doing it. About the difference between authenticity and the performance of authenticity. Because here's something that doesn't get said enough in these fan conversations. People are supposed to change. Artists are supposed to evolve. A version of Baris Arduc frozen permanently at whatever moment his fans loved him most would not actually be serving his full humanity. Growth is not betrayal. Complexity is not corruption. But the fans who were concerned in 2026 weren't necessarily wrong either. Not because change is bad, but because the specific quality of certain changes raised genuine questions. And asking questions about someone you care about is not the same as condemning them. By mid-2026, the discourse had reached a level where it was being covered in entertainment media, not just circulating within fan communities. Articles appeared. Some were thoughtful. Many were reductive. The clickbait versions framed it as a fall from grace, which was unfair and unearned. The more careful coverage acknowledged what was actually happening, that a significant, loyal, emotionally invested global fanbase was wrestling with their relationship to a public figure who seemed to be in a state of transition. And transition is probably the most honest word for it. Not collapse. Not decline. Not betrayal. Transition. Here's where the story reaches what might be its most important moment. Because somewhere in the latter half of 2026, something happened that shifted the conversation again. Baris Arduc gave an extended interview, and this one landed differently than the ones before it. Whether it was the publication, the format, the interviewer, or simply the timing, something cracked open in a way that felt more honest than what fans had been seeing. He spoke about pressure. About the weight of expectations, both internal and external. About the process of figuring out who you are when the world has decided who you should be. He didn't issue a dramatic statement or a rebuttal to the fan discourse. He simply spoke like a human being navigating something genuinely difficult. And for a significant portion of his fanbase, that interview landed like a relief. Like finally. Like there he is. It didn't resolve everything. Fan communities are rarely that simple. Some felt it was too little too late. Some felt it confirmed their worst fears about how out of touch he had become. But many people felt something ease. Felt the thread between themselves and this person they had admired for years pull taut again. What does that tell us? It tells us that the fans were never really angry. They were worried. They were grieving, in a small way, what they feared losing. And when they got even a glimpse of the person underneath the transition, they ran toward it. The question of whether Baris Arduc truly changed in 2026 doesn't have a clean answer. And maybe that's the most honest thing we can say. Yes, things shifted. His public presentation changed. His professional choices raised eyebrows. His relationship with his audience went through something turbulent. Those are real things that happened and that fans observed and reacted to. But change and loss are not the same thing. And a person being more complex, more guarded, more aware of the cost of public life than they once were, that doesn't make them a lesser version of themselves. It might actually make them more themselves. More honest about the reality of what this kind of life demands. Baris Arduc built his reputation on something genuine. That genuineness is still there in the work, in the moments when the guard drops, in the interview that broke through in late 2026. What changed is the container around it. The way he manages access to it. And whether that's a compromise or an act of self-preservation is something only he can truly know. What fans are left with is this. A career that is still unfolding. A talent that is still developing. A human being who is navigating something that very few people on Earth have to navigate, the experience of being a public figure in the age of relentless digital scrutiny, with millions of people who feel they know you watching every move and deciding whether you're still the person they fell in love with. That's an enormous thing to carry. And the fact that so many fans cared enough to have this conversation, to worry, to debate, to hope, that's not a sign of a broken relationship. That's a sign of one that still matters. Stories like this one don't end. They just keep adding chapters. And whatever comes next for Baris Arduc, the chapter of 2026 will always be the one where his fans proved just how deeply invested they were. Not in a version of him frozen in amber, but in the real, evolving, complicated human being behind the screen. That matters. For him. And maybe for all of us who have ever loved a piece of art so much that the artist behind it starts to feel like someone we know. What do you think? Let us know in the comments.